Santiago, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you to all of you as well for asking us as BCG to come here today. We are very pleased to be back on campus again to talk about some of the energy issues. I think I last spoke to a group here last year regarding some elements of the Clean Tech Challenge. So once again, we're pleased to be here. I'm excited to be part of the day. I've had a look at the speakers and who's here, and it's an impressive group, so congratulations as well to the organizing committee and to all of you for getting a very interesting and dynamic group of speakers here today. Today I'm going to talk to you and try to set the scene a little bit from a industry perspective in terms of the new dynamics of energy. That's what we're calling the presentation today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the sources of energy, the trade flows of those sources of energy, the prices of the energy, and really then how that is impacting the world we see around us today and how that's changed over time. Before I do that, I'd like to just get a sense of the depth of energy knowledge in the room so I can tailor the presentation a little bit. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands in three different groups. The first group is people who work in the industry or have worked in the industry, so are fairly knowledgeable. Second group, you're maybe not an expert, but you know a fair bit about energy. And the third group is here more because they're interested and wouldn't consider themselves all that knowledgeable. So just to get a sense, first group, how many people work in the industry or have, okay, so that's most of the group actually, right? And the remainder, I won't even ask them because it looks to me like it was about 80 or 90% of you. So good. I will then probably feel at the liberty to use a lot of technical terms and some of the actual industry metrics and not spend much time explaining them. Very good. From our perspective, the 20th century was characterized in the world and the geopolitical scene by what I would call ideological geopolitical events. I think in the past 10, 12 years as we've gone into the 21st century, that has shifted to a very much resource-based geopolitical debate, and geopolitical events are driving that. A lot of the ideologies among nations are coming closer into line, although there's still quite a bit of difference between East and West, but nonetheless coming closer into line. And what's driving a lot of the events in the world and what's driving a lot of the geopolitical debate is things around resources and resource constraints. What are some events that you've seen? So a lot of these you've heard about, Santiago mentioned today, and all of you know about these, but it really brings into focus, I think, what we're seeing. So four main events in the last couple of years that have really driven it. First of all, the Gulf disaster, so Macondo, the worst environmental disaster ever in the United States, brought to the forefront the fact that what people considered had become a safe industry, the upstream oil industry, actually was present with a lot of tail risk just waiting to happen. The unrest in the Middle East and Northern Africa, the Arab Spring, which put at risk a previously stable source of crude oil supplies. Certainly there was some interesting regimes there, but nonetheless it had prior to the Arab Spring had been much more stable. Still hasn't settled down. That's put a lot of stress on the oil positions. Fukushima, a major nuclear disaster, the first one in many, many years. A level 7 incident, which sent shockwaves throughout the industry and throughout the world. And most recently, the Iranian oil embargo, which I'll talk about in a little bit later, about the impact that's had and is having and continues to have going forward. So the point simply being, these events, I think, bring to bear and show how important it has become on a geopolitical basis. So how has it been reflected? I'm going to talk today about four elements of this. I'll start with energy sources, move on to what that's doing in trade flows, talk about the price levels, and then talk about some of the competitive landscape. And I'm going to talk a bit about what the old wisdom was, provide some data, and then come back at the end and tell you what kind of the new wisdom seems to be. So in each of these areas, there I think were some truths that were traditionally considered 10 years ago to be the direction of travel in the industry. First one, in terms of sources, if you were to scroll back a few years, coal was very much out of fashion. Coal was considered a dirty fuel. It produced a lot of carbon emissions, and the world was going to gradually wean itself off of coal. As part of that, there was a nuclear renaissance which was kicking off and starting, and you saw a tremendous amount of new builds announced and the industry really being revitalized over time. You saw a huge rush to be green, so people were going to be 20% of the overall energy supply was going to be provided by renewables. That was the energy sources picture. energy trade flows, there was very much a dynamic between East and West. The East produced the oil and the energy and the resources we needed, and then the West consumed them. That was kind of the dynamic you saw. Price levels, this was an interesting one because they were relatively stable. Now, if you were around in the 70s, you'd say, well, there were price shocks then and there were price shocks going on. Actually, I'll show you some data on it. The prices moved of the commodities moved in a relatively narrow band, and that's changed since 2005. And they've really spiked up tremendously, and you've seen a tremendous spike in volatility as well, and that's filtered through to many, many different areas of the industry. And then the competitive landscape is a very interesting one from a business perspective, which I think is interesting to this group particularly. You've seen a huge shift of power. So the conventional wisdom, 10 years ago even, you saw national oil companies really being national oil companies staying put. NOCs really producing in their own countries. You saw international oil companies with a very privileged position, bringing expertise and being the partners of choice to develop new reserves. And you saw oilfield services companies playing the role of advisors in providing services into the NOCs and the IOCs, but basically confined to that niche. So that's kind of what you saw in the past. Now let's go through each of those one at a time and see where we are today and what's taking us. So sources of energy. This is an interesting graph. It starts in 1980, goes through 2030, and in the middle point where that dotted line is where we are today. And this is basically the world's consumption of energy broken down into 5 different buckets. And what you'll see here, and I think the main message of this, is that each of these sources have increased over time. And there's been very little substitution. As a matter of fact, some downturns you saw in the 2000s, I was referring to coal. Coal took a slight dip, but then you can see it's come back very strongly. The point here is that there is no one energy source which will actually replace or save the world in any way. All of these energy sources are becoming more important and growing over time. And if you look forward to 2030, the forecast is that we will need about 30% more energy than we have today. So again, I'm going to show you data during the course of the next 30 minutes or so where you'll see that we need the energy needs have grown tremendously and the sources are being constricted. Nonetheless, we need another 30% by 2030. What's driving that? Well, I mean, clearly population growth. We crossed the 7 billion mark last year, and we are targeting 10 billion by, I think, 2100 is the date. So population growth is clearly one thing. In addition, of course, economic development is driving that as well. So just statistics, I think in Europe there are 400 cars per each 1,000 people. The U.S. drives a lot more, so there's about 600 cars per 1,000 people. And if you were to go to China, the number is 18. One note on here, this is IEA data that we use, and so we use their categories of 5 different sources. I actually find that their way they characterize renewables is a bit misleading. That renewables bucket looks like it's a pretty large and important part of the energy mix, and it is because it includes hydro. That number right there is 69% hydro. So yes, it is a renewable source and a very important one, but it's a bit misleading because today the renewable debate and a lot of where the money is flowing into and a lot of the things that are interesting from a business perspective are more around solar, wind, biomass, et cetera. And those percentages are much lower. It's 14% wind, 10% biomass, 6% geothermal, and 1% solar of the number of renewables there. So just to kind of put in perspective what we're talking about when we talk about solar and wind and renewables and the renewables agenda is not yet as important a part of the mix as that would suggest. So let's talk about a few of these in a bit more detail. So let's come on to coal. So I mentioned coal a few times now, and I said it was kind of going out of fashion. Now it's come back into fashion a little bit. Interesting question is why? Because coal still hasn't been cleaned up all that much. On the left-hand side, I think this is probably one of the main reasons why. What you'll see there is you see 2 bars above each of these producing these regions, and the bar on the left is the production bar. So the green bar shows how much coal they produce, and the right bar, the reddish one, shows how much coal they consume. The interesting thing is most of those bars are pretty level. So coal is produced where it is consumed, or consumed where it is produced, if you want to look at it the other way around. Why that's important is that actually that means that security of supply is ensured through domestic sources and not long supply chains and long trade flows that are dependent upon various choke points and can be disrupted. And that is absolutely critical for countries. So as they develop more and more their energy needs, coal is a very logical place to look for it. Now, that hasn't changed the emissions picture. So if you look on the right-hand side, this shows the CO2 emissions from new coal production coming online since 2005. It's an interesting graph because there's a couple ways to interpret it. First of all, that green line is the OECD countries. So you could say, well, actually, CO2 emissions from the OECD countries because of new coal had basically flat. And all the new emissions are coming from the non-OECD countries. So one thing would say, well, we have to curb demand in the non-OECD countries. If you look at CO2 production per capita in the non-OECD countries, it is still a factor of about 25% of what it is in the OECD countries. So as long as economic development continues and as long as additional power is consumed, I don't think you'll actually be able to address all of it through the non-OECD countries. Nonetheless, the point here is coal has a certain number of drivers that will continue to mean that it is a very important energy source, very important for security of supply, and it will, though, however, very negatively impact the CO2 balance. So let's talk about nuclear for a moment. This shows the number of newly commissioned reactors year by year, starting back in 1965. And what you can see on this is, on the left-hand side here, all those strong bars, which were getting up to the 30s in the mid-80s, tailed off and dropped off dramatically in 1990. What happened in 1990? Most of you remember there were some very high-profile serious accidents. So a near miss on 3 Mile Island, but that scared the heck out of everybody in the U.S. And, of course, Chernobyl, which wasn't a near miss, it was an awful catastrophe. And that shook the public's confidence in nuclear. You saw a tremendous tail-off into the 90s and into the 2000s. You also saw gas coming on very strongly, particularly in the U.S. and in Europe, replacing substituting in for a lot of what would have been nuclear demand otherwise. It was a new clean source. It was better. It was going to actually save the world. It was a dash for gas we saw happening. The renaissance of nuclear was then projected to, and actually we saw it started happening in 2010, which forecast had about 154 gigawatts. So there were previously, I believe, about 378 gigawatts of existing nuclear power. And actually there was a fairly high concentration in a number of countries. So the existing reactors, there's 439 reactors in the world today. 104 of those are in the US. 58 of them are in France, so very high concentrations there. 32 in Russia, with 10 more planned or under construction. 14 in China, with 25 more planned or under construction. So there's a fairly strong geographic concentration in nuclear. Nuclear renaissance was coming, and then Fukushima happened. So Fukushima. I'll give you the punchline of this for us is that there's been a nuclear slowdown, but not a nuclear dramatic step change in what's going to happen. If you look at before Fukushima, I gave you the number before of 154 new gigawatts of capacity. In addition, there was about 60 gigawatts of capacity, which was going to be subject to life extensions, which took you to roughly a number of 516, aiming for 2020 versus 378 in 2010. Now, what you're seeing today, as most forecasts would indicate, that by 2020, you'll actually see a drop of about 80 gigawatts in what would have been there, so down to about 436, but still means a 15% increase in nuclear capacity versus what would have been about a 37% increase if all the projects had gone ahead and been realized in any case. And I believe the main reason that's happening is because you've seen 3 distinct responses from countries. You've seen the U-turn countries, which have come out of Fukushima saying, no way, we're not going to do this anymore. Led by Germany, very high profile. Merkel reversed her stance probably 6 months after she said we're going to recommission all the nuclear plants. She said, okay, we're going to shut them down. Switzerland, very similar dynamic. And in Italy, they had a referendum where 94% of the people said no more nuclear. So those were the U-turn countries. Then you had the countries remain kind of neutral. They didn't really come out and say it either way. And you have the countries which are continually supporting it. And the characteristic of the continued support countries is an interesting one. Most of them are centrally planned economies. So in China and in Russia, where you have the 35 reactors I talked about before, there's been no change to the plans around nuclear. They realize that, as that graph I put up before shows, nuclear is a very important part of their mix going forward, and they need to keep increasing the pace there. Interesting thing from a business perspective of this, too, is that you could suggest or you could feel that the nuclear companies have taken a tremendous hit. I mean, this is a pretty significant fall, even though it's not a step change, it's a fall for them. actually, I believe that their revenues will probably increase, if anything, because the additional O&M costs, particularly around all the different safety elements that are not only going to go into the new builds, but all the safety revisions and increased scrutiny on the existing plants, has actually been a good opportunity for many of the nuclear companies, and certainly a needed and warranted one. So let's talk then about renewables. So everybody knows renewables targets were set at very ambitious levels. On the left-hand side here, you see what their targets were for share of renewables in the overall mix put forward. And on the dark green is the level that they have today, and the lighter green, or the stuff on the far right, is then what the target was for 2020. You can see there's been very good progress, but many countries are still have a long way to go. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your perspective, the targets, which are very, very much supported by subsidies in government, are under huge pressure. So many governments, particularly in the EU, have announced scale-backs on their support and scale-backs on their tariffs. This shows Italy, Netherlands, Spain, and Germany. I think the most recent announcement was in Spain on January 27th, where they have phased out the feed-in tariffs. Well, sorry, it's a temporary suspension of feed-in tariffs until further notice. I think that further notice might be a while in coming. In the UK, it was a whole legal battle. First they were out, now they're back in, but nonetheless they're going to be scaled back. The government overstepped a bit its enthusiasm in curbing those back. And the renewables agenda will change dramatically without the subsidies. Why? This is a chart that shows what we call the levelized cost of electricity. So I think most of you will be familiar with this as a number, but just to be clear, this includes the capital investment up front as well as the operating cost of a plant, as opposed to just the marginal cost of a plant to dispatch the power. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that conventionals are very much kind of what I call in the money of the wholesale electricity price. Some up, some down, depending upon the economic assumptions that go into them, but certainly very much viable sources. If you look at some of the renewables, the river hydro and the wind onshore are in the money now today as well. Then you start going further to right, biomass, biogas, offshore wind, and then photovoltaic. And you'll see that on today's basis, they are not in the money. However, there is the green arrow indicates what we believe, the downward pressure on that we believe will come, the advancement of technology and the cost reductions by 2020. So very a positive story. And on the other side, we think that there'll actually be some increases on the left-hand side, particularly as it relates to some of the charges coming from carbon emissions and some of the increased scrutiny in some of those areas. But the direction of travel is positive. The left-hand side here looks at wind turbines, and this charts basically the cost of a wind turbine price over time. So in terms of the cost progression, you'll see that they have fallen by basically a factor of 2 since 1980. And on the right-hand side, you see the same type of chart for photovoltaic in terms of the experience curve. And actually there, you'll see that they've fallen by a factor of 3. And we break it out. There's been even more dramatic. That's 3 is an average. The top line shows photovoltaic cells overall, and the lower one shows the thin cell. So a good story there. So we've talked about coal, we've talked about nuclear, we've talked a bit about renewables. The big one is still out there, oil. The left-hand side over here shows the distribution of oil reserves in the world. What you see is a huge concentration, no news to anybody, in the Middle East and in the FSU. Actually, about 70% of the reserves, so about 62% are in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, and other Middle Eastern countries, and about 70% if you then add on the FSU. If you look at the top, we've kind of color-coded these numbers. This is the number of years of remaining production at the current rates. And if it's green, it means, okay, it's more than 50 years, not something we're concerned about too quickly. Yellow is kind of in the middle, and then the red one, or brownish it looks like on the screen, actually means it's less than 20 years. So you see places like North America and Europe, and actually Asia Pacific, have less than 20 years of remaining capacity, whereas in the Middle East it's far greater. That's created a huge trade imbalance. Remember I said before about East producing, West consuming. That's showed on the left-hand side here. And what you can see is the countries led by Asia Pacific, or the regions led by Asia Pacific, US and Europe, are both basically importing 70% or more of their energy needs, whilst others are exporting at huge numbers. I mean, even Africa, 300, nearly 400%, FSU above 200%, and the Middle East above 200% as well. The trade flows themselves, though, are usually subject to long supply chains, and they are hugely susceptible to disruption. Fully 50%, 49.5% I think is the exact number, flows through 6 strategic choke points in the world. So several of these you'll be familiar with: Panama Canal, Suez Canal. The one that is most in the news lately is the Straits of Hormuz. Now, the Straits of Hormuz is located down in the Middle East near Iran, and it accounts for 35% of the daily waterborne oil flow through the Straits of Hormuz. That's 20% of the worldwide oil, 17 million barrels a day. It's also absolutely critical for LNG. 35% of the world's LNG flows through that. It's mostly Qatari production. So fully 80 BCM last year went through the Straits of Hormuz. And certainly if some of the noise were true and Iran could close it, there's a few other supply routes that could be used. There's the East-West pipeline. There's some NGL pipelines that we could use. But basically, if you added all that up, that would account for about 3 million barrels, maybe a little bit more depending upon how much you could squeeze in. So it would not come anywhere close to replacing the 17 million barrels. This starts to illustrate why there's so much focus right now on Iran's reactions to the embargo that's being put into place. If we move on to gas, when we think about gas in the same terms we thought about oil, so the same picture, you'll see that it's not quite as bad. It's not 70%, but it's 65% concentrated in Russia, Iran, Qatar, and the Middle East. And the trade imbalances are less extreme, and I'll come back to the U.S. in just a second. The trade imbalances are less extreme, but nonetheless something that if you are thinking this from a geopolitical basis, you're probably going to be concerned about. The story, however, on each of these regions is very difficult, so I'd like to take a minute and just talk about the regions. The left-hand side is North America, and North America has gone through a tectonic shift. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second in terms of shale gas. The bars here, the dark green is basically conventional gas. We put tight gas in there as well, and the light green is shale gas. So you can see already from 2010 to 2020, the U.S. has shifted its balance quite a bit. That tiny blue sliver at the top is LNG. So LNG is becoming less and less important in the United States, and they're even going to start exporting LNG, as you know. And in 2030, that balance will only shift more, moving towards about 50%. Europe, however, is a different story. Europe is much more dependent on imports. The dark blue is LNG, and the light blue is pipeline. So the story in Europe has been very much increasing LNG shipments through various terminals which have been built, and then, in addition, increasing pipeline capacity. Going forward, we believe LNG will continue to grow, and that pipeline gas will also continue to maintain its importance. And I'll come back to shale gas in just a second because there's a lot of questions marks around the role of shale gas going forward in Europe. And in China, basically, once again, they're growing dramatically, and they're growing across all sources, and will require indigenous, will require shale, will grow that, and will continue to suck up LNG as much as they can as well. And they're building a few new terminals as well. Shale gas. This has been, for me, at least from my perspective, one of the tectonic shifts in the past 4 or 5 years. I think everybody's heard about it, certainly in this room, with all of you being involved in energy. You're well aware of the progression there. The chart shows on the left the increasing importance of shale gas over the last several years. It grew by a factor of 7 from 2005 to 2011. So those of you involved in the E&P industry will know that a factor of 7 to grow production is tremendous. Of course, it has to do with the actual particular nature of the wells. You can bring them on in a modular way. But nonetheless, it's a tremendous influx of resources, of capital, and companies into the U.S. to take advantage of this. The right-hand side shows that. The right-hand side has 2 elements to it. First of all, it shows the level of overall deal value in shale gas since 2000. And you can see that it kind of had some activity, and it really had an inflection point and changed direction in 2008. 2008, you saw, I think since 2008, there's been $140 billion flowing into shale gas. There's been over 240 M&A deals, and all of those companies at the right, of course, the global leaders, BP, Statoil, people here from today, ExxonMobil with their big deal, which kind of shocked people at the price they paid when they did it, Total, Chevron, etc. So there's been a huge flow of resources into shale gas, and that's caused a lot of people to ask, okay, now in the rest of the world, what's going to happen with shale gas? Overall, across the world, there's several different areas where shale gas can be important. The most, I think, topical one today is really Europe. Latest CIA study says, yep, absolutely, there's a lot of shale gas in Europe, something like 630, 640 TCF under some basic assumptions and estimates. And one of the most promising countries for that is probably going to be Poland. There's 187 TCF there. A lot of companies have gone in now and have made some noise. ExxonMobil, people watch them pretty closely, ConocoPhillips, Chevron have all gone in and started exploring. That said, the prognosis and I think the momentum, whilst people are paying a lot of attention and investing resources into it, it will not be as much of a game changer in the near term, we believe, as it has been in the U.S. Now, why? Well, the geological formations are fairly different. They're a lot deeper. There is not anywhere near the level of activity in terms of drilling rigs and all the expertise that's needed to actually make it happen. The regulatory regime isn't in place and will not be in place for a while, even if Poland goes quickly. And in addition, I think there's been 9 wells drilled so far, and the results coming out of them so far are a bit disappointing. So I'd say we don't know what's going to happen. You need to watch the space. But in the next few years, it won't change the landscape as much as it has in the U.S. Production, if it starts flowing, when it starts flowing in the next 5, 6, 7 years, could have a pretty large impact. But at this point, for most of the forecasts that we've seen, it's not yet forecast to be a game changer. Now, that said, I don't know if 6, 7 years ago anybody would have said that shale gas would be a game changer in the U.S., so who knows, right? But I think that there's enough things that speak about differing conditions in the European shale gas space versus the U.S. that show that it will be a bit slower to get started. So that's the resource side. If you remember, I started off saying there's 4 areas I'm going to talk about. So that's really the big chunk of the resource side which I wanted to talk about. Let's move to prices for a second. This shows the prices, and we've basically indexed the commodities prices to 2000 at 100 and said, okay, over the course of time, what's happened to those? And you can see certainly there were a lot of movement up and down in prices, and if you were living through any of those times, you might say, okay, it was highly volatile and we saw big price spikes and going up and down. Actually, though, in perspective, I think you'll have seen that there's really 2 phases. Before 2005, moving in kind of what today looks like a narrow band. Again, if you're in that band, it might not feel so narrow. To 2005, 2011. And I think it's difficult to argue that prices have not spiked tremendously and are not demonstrating tremendously additional amounts of volatility versus what was happening prior to 2005. Simple thing, the Gulf disaster raised costs by about 5% across the E&P space. The Arab Spring, over the course of that and different points in time, caused prices to spike by about $25 a barrel. Fukushima required Japan's reactions post-Fukushima brought in 20% of the world's LNG supply flowing into Japan. The Iran oil embargo, which was finally decided on the 23rd of January, has caused, as I showed just a few minutes ago in terms of the Straits of Hormuz, has caused, first of all, a repositioning, a reshuffling of who's buying what oil, a lot of nervousness about the supplies, and actually a strong reduction in the spare capacity of that, and has caused a lot of jitters in the market. Prices hit $125 yesterday. All of that has led to what you see on the right over here. So oil price itself has seen a lot of volatility. On the left-hand side, this is the WTI oil spot price. You can see it jumping up and down since 2002. And on the right side, we show how many days in any one year demonstrated price changes of very large magnitudes. And you can see that over time, that's been increasing. And so far, it has been sustained in 2012. Why? What drives that? Come on to that for a second, because there's several drivers which I think are important. In our view, one of the biggest drivers is actually the spare capacity available in the system. What I think you find is that when the spare capacity falls below about 2 million barrels a day, people get very, very worried, and they start bidding up the future supplies. Once they start bidding up, speculation kicks in, a bit of froth on the top, and that makes prices and the volatility behind those prices go up even higher. Most of the time, that spare capacity is held by OPEC, and often usually by Saudi Arabia. And they're the ones who will make up the swing capacity and the supply. And even if the world believes there's enough oil there, who will get their hands on the spare capacity becomes a pretty important dynamic. And I think what you find is that there's a very large division between price levels when you have more than 2 million barrels spare capacity and when you have less. So I think that's one of the key drivers. There's a few others. First of all, there's a fairly steep shoulder. This is a supply curve of the liquid hydrocarbons. And so on the left-hand side, there's a range of supply scenarios. I think in some cases in Saudi Arabia, it probably costs you a few dollars a barrel to actually produce oil. As you move over to other OPEC countries, it starts increasing. Conventional oil takes you up to probably $22, $23 on the high end. You hit the FSU, sometimes difficult to get data, but I think probably between $15 and $25 in terms of their production. And then you start hitting the shoulder. So you have Venezuelan heavy oil, which is probably somewhere in the middle of that. You've got deep water, which has, again, gained a lot of attention in the press and has been a lot of promising reserves for the future. And that's clearly true, but the point is also it's a lot more expensive to develop. You get into the Arctic, you get to oil sands, and then you start getting into the really expensive things on the right-hand side like oil shale and GTL and CTL. So clearly, as we need more and more oil, the supply costs, which were before very low, the curve, certainly there's oil there to be found, but the supply curve and the easy oil is kind of already happened. So supply costs have increased and increasing dramatically. That has been one of the things that's driven it. The other thing is actually a very interesting vicious circle, which is on the right-hand side. So as the countries that are very resource-rich have found more and more ways to increase their revenue and have seen more money flowing into the public coffers, take Saudi Arabia, for example, they have then actually started spending that money much more freely. And they have spent that money in very ways related to public services, social needs. They've kept their populations very happy. Well, what that has meant, though, that is as their budgets have increased, their need for a high oil price has also increased, kind of feeding on itself. And if you were to scroll back 20 years, I don't know the exact numbers, but the break-even oil price for Saudi Arabia was $10 or below. 10 years, it was creeped up a bit. Right now, the break-even oil price for Saudi Arabia to balance its budget is $84. So they have a bit of an interest in maintaining a high oil price, particularly given the Arab Spring and what's gone on in other places. Kuwait's not quite as high. They're at $75. But you start seeing that there's a vested interest to keep the oil prices high, where before they certainly wanted to have oil prices, but it wasn't as much of a social and political imperative for some of these countries. So that tends to feed on itself as well. What else is driving it? We think about demand and said, I showed you before some pictures about increasing demand, particularly from China and other countries. So certainly demand is important. And if you look at basically the IEA reference scenario, you'll see demand increasing by between 0.6 and 1%, depending on what part of the world. And that actually shows that the green bars on the top show what additional demand will require, what we expect will be additional demand in the oil space. But what the actual shocking picture, I think, is the blue. That shows the decline in oil. And this is actually really tough data to forecast because we don't know the decline of a lot of the fields in some of the less transparent parts of the world, Middle East, Russia. We don't know exactly what's declining. The best guess estimate is about 5.1%. So this chart is based upon a number of 5.1%. But actually, if you look at some of the fields where we have a lot better data since 2000, from 2000 to 2011, fields that we have been discovered in that time frame, the decline rate is 12.6%. So this picture based at 5.1%. Imagine what it would be if you actually put the 12.6% in there. And basically, the forecast here means that you would have, if you didn't replace that production, you would have a 5% CAGR means you get to half the production in about 13 years, which is not really that long. So this is a case of an industry that has to run very, 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 very hard just to stand still in terms of production. And this is something I think it's very clear when you see the data, but it's something people sometimes forget, how much work is needed just to maintain the current level of production. Let's move on then to the final piece of what I wanted to talk about, which is kind of the changing competitive dynamic. So I mentioned national oil companies and international oil companies before. What have we seen? The national oil companies, which kind of stayed at home and developed resources in partnership with others, have now, of course, gone much further abroad. So if you look at Petronas, the Malaysian oil company, they're present in 30 countries. Sinopec, present in 27 countries. You can see many others there. Brazil, Petronas, so a lot of noise about what they're doing at home, but oh, by the way, they're also present in 20 countries. And if you look at the actual activity in M&A and look at the activity in the level of transactions, it's increased by 7-fold from 2002 to 2007. You see the Chinese companies becoming particularly active. So in each of the last 3 years, three of the top 6 companies were the Chinese oil companies, Sinopec, CNOOC, and CNPC. Very acquisitive. They're outbidding IOCs. They're looking for less returns. They're thinking about it more from a long-term security of supply perspective, particularly in places like Africa. And as you think about who controls the natural resources of the world, it's very interesting to think about a few statistics of national oil companies. So some numbers to think about. 75% of the world's oil reserves are controlled by OPEC. 65% of the world's gas comes from 5 countries: Iran, Russia, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Algeria. 90% of the oil is directly or indirectly controlled by NOCs. And less than 25% of that oil is accessible to private companies. So there's been a power shift, a dramatic power shift from IOCs towards NOCs. This is just some data around the largest energy acquisitions involving Chinese firms. I'll let you read through some of those today, and you can see how active the Chinese companies have become. Again, with a very clear agenda of locking in security of supply, or trying to lock in the security of supply for what they know will be tremendous energy needs. A very capital-rich country acquiring reserves. So what has that done in terms of changing positions? The left-hand side of this bar, on the left-hand side of this chart, and it shows 1970. Definitions you can debate a little bit, but roughly the amount of reserves that were accessible to IOCs, about 85%. Today, that number is dropped, again, depending on the definition you use, but below 10% under most estimates, what percentage IOCs can actually access. And 65% of that is NOCs. On the right-hand side, we're talking a little bit about what is driving that dynamic and how they've been repositioned. So NOCs are becoming stronger and stronger, not only from the resources they control, but the way they leverage contractors. They're becoming more and more aggressive in the way they negotiate terms. You can look at some of the recent production agreements in Iraq for some great examples. The IOCs are having much more difficulty over time accessing concessions. They are no longer as sought out for their expertise. And actually OFS firms, oil field services firms, are becoming more and more important in the services they provide and how they provide them, and the way NOCs are using them versus the way NOCs used to actually rely on IOCs. The NOCs are providing much more services to the development phase. They're providing the production phase input, and actually even training services in the NOCs. So the balance of power is shifted away from IOCs, much more strongly toward OOCs, and for a much more increased role of the OFS firms. So we started off by saying that you saw a number of things happening in the last decade around 4 different dimensions. So as a reminder, what were those dimensions? Energy sources, we said coal is going out of fashion, nuclear is going to have a huge renaissance, and renewables are going to be 20% of the supply. What do we believe today? Coal, like it or not, is an engine for growth. Nuclear is going to keep growing, but potentially not the big renaissance we were expecting. Renewables, I think there's some strong doubts about what the growth path will be there, and if Europe will meet the targets, the aggressive targets it set out. And there's been limited progress in some of the global forums, particularly the most recent one in South Africa. Energy trade flows, as I said, the West consumes, the East produces. Actually, you've seen West producing a bit more, particularly as it relates to shale gas in the U.S., and tremendously increasing consumption in the East, so changing that balance a bit. Price levels no longer really staying within a narrow band. They've structurally moved to a new level, and as an observer of this, I don't think there's any time soon when you're going to get back to the price levels you saw prior to 2005 across the board, whether it be oil, gas, even down to iron ore and some of the other base commodities. And the dynamic where price was driven by upstream supply mostly, I think, has shifted to actually being driven very much by what spare capacity is in the market and how much geopolitical events are influencing that. And the competitive landscape, NOCs are not staying at home. They're becoming more and more aggressive. They're controlling more and more of the reserves. OFS companies are doing more and more, providing more and more services and becoming much more important and replacing IOCs in some cases. And IOCs have not been growing their production. Actually, the chart that slipped out of this production was showing the decline in IOC production from 2000 to 2015. So I'll just voice it over. Basically, ExxonMobil, who all you know very well, decreased at greater than a half a percentage point in terms of a CAGR over that time. Shell, about 2.6% since 2000, the CAGR. Total, 0.6%, and Chevron, 0.4%, which adds up to significant figures. So I'm going to stop there. I think what I've tried to illustrate and set the groundwork for is a lot of different dynamic forces at work. The overall geopolitical focus has shifted away from ideological and towards very much a resource-oriented one. I think that's one of the key motivations behind a lot of the moves and a lot of the activities of governments and regulators and policy today. It's not going to change, at least in our view, that much going forward. Thank you very much for listening.